Hi, my name is Ernie Hall, and I've been a member of UU Schenectady for over 30 years. During that time, I've developed a great admiration and love for the history of Unitarian Universalism and for the story of this congregation. In these videos, I hope to share what I admire most with you. The first obvious question is why we want to share these stories with newcomers. To me, there are several reasons. First, I find great inspiration in knowing that we are part of a living tradition that dates back many centuries, populated by amazing and admirable leaders, and which has had a great impact on the development of liberal religion and on the history of this country. Second, telling our story is a great way of describing what we are all about, our principles and values. Unitarian Universalism is quite unique as a religion. Instead of having a great leader or a great book far in the past that we seek to preserve, ours is a constantly evolving faith that uses science, philosophy, and reason to grow our understanding of truth, justice, and the essence of existence. Our history shows us this evolution and how we arrived where we are today. So let's begin by looking at how Unitarian Universalism developed. And for that, I'm going to share some slides with you. So we're going to start our journey today by talking about where the names came from. You may have already know this, but we'll just review this briefly. So Unitarians differed from mainstream Christians early on, very early on, in the belief that God is one. God is a unitary being, and therefore Jesus is not God, but rather a great teacher. For our purposes, you'll see that Unitarians from the very beginning put a high value on freedom of thought, and then later in the development on social justice. Universalists, on the other hand, differed from the early Christians in believing that God was an all-loving being and that he would never condemn anyone to eternal punishment. Both of these, you may be interested to know that both of these beliefs were shared by many early Christians in the period right after Christ's life. And there was no unity of thought around these topics. And that all changed in 325 AD when the Roman Emperor Constantine called together all of the bishops in the rapidly expanding church of the Roman Catholic Church and got them together in hopes of unifying the message of Christianity and creating peace in his kingdom. They debated these topics and eventually voted on what Christianity, mainstream Christianity now believes, that Jesus is God, a belief in the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit, and other things such as the virgin birth and the existence of hell. Therefore, Unitarians, the early Unitarian and Universalist beliefs were considered heresies. And in those days, being a heretic was not a very good thing. So the beliefs, people who had these beliefs were quiet about it. And really not much changed for the next 1,000 years. Now, both religions developed separately. So we're going to look at them, their early development separately, starting with Unitarianism. As I said, not much changed until the middle of the 1400s. And what really caused the change was the invention of the printing press and the translation of the Bible into some of the popular languages of the time. That allowed many more people to read the Bible themselves. And they came to realize that the teachings of the church and some of its practices were not consistent with Jesus's message. And therefore, they demanded changes. And this caused the Protestant Reformations, started by people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, and others you may have heard about. In our case, the reformer that we want to talk about is a person by the name of Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus was born about the same time as Martin Luther, and he lived in Spain. And he was something of a child prodigy. As a teenager, he was able to read and write not only in Spanish, but in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. And so he was able to actually read the Bible in some of the original texts that he was able to access when he went to university. And after reading these texts, he came to the conclusion that indeed Jesus was not God, but again, just a great teacher, and that Jesus's message was consistent with the ideas of diversity of thought, toleration of individual beliefs, and the use of reason in forming our ideas about religion and about God. He even went so far as to suggest, for example, that perhaps God was just the spirit of life that exists in all of us. Imagine how radical an idea that was in the 1500s. He wrote two very popular books about this subject, and his ideas spread fairly quickly. However, his ideas got him in trouble, not only obviously with the mainstream Christian church, which was holding the Inquisition at that time, but also with other Protestant leaders, because his ideas just really went too far. So he had to spend his life in hiding in general. But finally, in 1553, he decided to go to Geneva, where John Calvin sort of ruled, in order to debate Calvin and try to convince Calvin of Servetus's ideas. When he got to Geneva, Calvin immediately had Servetus arrested and put on trial, and eventually he was executed by burning at the stake, along with burning all the copies of his books that they could find. But by this point, Servetus had quite a few followers, but this made it obvious they were not welcome in Western Europe. And they had heard that in Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and what is now Romania, in those days Transylvania, were much more tolerant of different ways of thinking. So the followers of Servetus go to Eastern Europe. And in particular, they find a friendly welcome in Transylvania, which is a kingdom being led by King John Sigismund at the time. And John Sigismund has a Lutheran bishop who is his spiritual advisor, Francis David, or Ferenc David. Francis David is convinced of the Unitarian message, and he actually converts to Unitarianism. And he convinces King John to call a meeting of all the religions in Transylvania. And at that meeting, King John declares religious freedom for his kingdom, the first and only kingdom that allowed religious freedom. King John also converts to Unitarianism. Unfortunately, soon after this meeting, King John dies in an accident. And as these things go, the subsequent king is not as friendly to the Unitarian message. In particular, he's convinced by his advisors that the Unitarians, who are constantly rethinking their ideas about religion in the spirit of Servetus and his diversity of thought. In particular, this religious innovation that he sees them, that he accuses them of, is suggested to be a bad thing. So they pass a law against religious innovation, and Francis David is brought to trial for practicing religious innovation. He refuses to give up this approach to religion. He says specifically that what we would now call the free and responsible search for truth and meaning is essential to Unitarianism. And so he's imprisoned and eventually dies in prison, never really renouncing his belief in the idea of continuing to evolve one's views of religion's place in the world. Well, during this time, subsequently, there is a Christian counter-Reformation, and so the Unitarians are no longer welcome in Eastern Europe. So once again, they go back to Western Europe, settling in places like Holland and in particular in England. And for the next 200 years, practiced their religion quietly until finally in the late 1700s, the first Unitarian chapel in England is opened, and people are allowed to practice the Unitarian faith freely in England. And the most famous minister in England at that time is a man called Joseph Priestley. Now, some of you may remember Priestley's name because he was the scientist who discovered oxygen, but he's also a Unitarian minister. And while in London in the late 1700s, he preached to many people, including Benjamin Franklin, who was in England at the time to try to gain concessions for the American colonies right before the American Revolution. Well, eventually, even though there's some acceptance, Joseph Priestley does not feel welcome in England anymore, and he decides to take his family and emigrate to the United States. So in 1794, Priestley moves from England to Philadelphia, which is then the capital of the newly formed United States, perhaps at the invitation of Benjamin Franklin. And he opens a church and immediately draws a large following. He preached to many of the founding fathers, including Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, John Adams. And you can see the ideas of Unitarianism, of freedom of thought and diversity and freedom of religion embodied in much of the writings of these founding fathers. Just don't tell, the religious right that the founding fathers were influenced by Unitarians and actually were deists. They'll find that very hard to believe. But it's true that 3 of the first 5 presidents of the United States were Unitarians. Well, Priestley started many new Unitarian churches in the Middle Atlantic states. And so he's really given credit for really starting Unitarianism in that part of our country. But there was another way that Unitarianism got a foothold in America. And we can thank our Pilgrim and Puritan ancestors for that. Now, when the Pilgrims and Puritans came to New England, they built many churches. And all of these churches were Congregationalists, Trinitarian Congregationalists. And that was the only religion available in New England. So much for freedom of religion in the early days. In addition to building these churches, they did something very important for us, and that is in 1648, they held a meeting to decide how they were going to govern themselves. And they established what we call Congregationalist polity. Congregationalist polity says that every church is independent. We own our own land, we own our own building, we hire our own staff and ministers. We are responsible and we are independent. We can even decide our own theology. Now, in modern day Unitarian Universalism, we follow Congregationalist polity, but we also choose to associate with all the other Unitarian Universalist churches in the Unitarian Universalist Association. But that is a free association. We are an independent church. Well, the Unitarian message in the late 1700s started to spread throughout New England. And many churches, many congregations in New England decided to convert to Unitarianism, the more liberal form of the what could be seen as the Congregationalist religion. And so during that time, many churches in New England converted from Congregationalist to Unitarian. In fact, by 1820, there were 125 Unitarian churches in the Boston area alone. And that included 20 of the 25 original churches built by the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So by 1820, Unitarianism is well established in the United States, is having an influence on the development of the new country, and really is concentrated in New England and in the mid-Atlantic states, but rapidly growing as the country grows. So what about Universalism? Well, we're not going to go into such great detail about the history of Universalism. Universalism in many ways is a very much homegrown, grassroots American religion. But there is an interesting story about how Universalism came to the United States. It developed, as did Unitarianism, in countries like England. And so in the 1700s, there were Universalist preachers in England. And the most famous of those ministers was John Murray. John Murray, as I say, was a very well-known Universalist minister in England. And in 1770 or thereabouts, unfortunately, his wife and child died from the plague that was going through England at the time. Well, John Murray had it with God. He renounced being a minister and decided to start over by moving to America. So he gets on a ship, goes across the Atlantic. The ship gets stuck on a reef in New Jersey, off the shore of New Jersey. So John Murray comes ashore in New Jersey. And the first person he meets is a farmer by the name of Thomas Potter. Now, Thomas Potter had a dream 10 years prior to that in which God told him if he built a chapel on his farm, God would send him a minister. So Potter says, "Hey, you're the minister." John Murray says, "No, I'm not doing that anymore." But Potter won't take no for an answer. And John Murray agrees to preach in Potter's chapel. He actually stays there for 3 years. Eventually, he's called by a group of Universalists in Gloucester, Mass, to come and start a church there in 1774. It's a Congregationalist church. So he goes there, preaches his Universalist message. The congregation votes to become Universalist. But the Congregationalists say, no way. This is our building. This is our stuff. You can't have it. We're gonna keep it. You have to go somewhere else. So the Universalists bring the case to the Supreme Court, and they rule that if the congregation votes to become Universalist, then the congregation gets to keep the building and all the property and other possessions of the congregation. That established the right of religious freedom in the United States. So that was a very, very important ruling. Another important point here is that John Murray eventually ends up marrying Judith Sargent Stevens, who was the director of religious education for his church. She's a very important figure in the very earliest days of the women's equality movement. She published catechisms for children that emphasized the equality of boys and girls, and many feminist essays and books, and really is well known within the feminist community as one of the first advocates of women's equality. Eventually, John Murray moves to Boston and establishes his ministry there. So here we have Boston around in the early 1800s, a hotbed of Unitarianism, a hotbed of Universalism. And there are many famous Boston ministers during that time. William Ellery Channing is a famous name. He's often credited with defining, he did many writings that spread the message of American Unitarianism. So he's often credited with defining American Unitarianism. Hosea Ballou is the most famous and most charismatic Universalist minister, following in the footsteps of John Murray at the time. He actually founded Tufts University as a Universalist university. And these very powerful figures probably started, again, the connection, the relationship between Unitarians and Universalists at that time. My favorite minister in Boston at that time was Theodore Parker, Theodore Parker was a tireless champion of social justice. His views were quite radical, and he didn't actually have a church. He used to preach at the music hall in Boston. He would attract 3,000 people to his services. He was part of the Underground Railroad, and actually his office, his building was part of the Underground Railroad, and he kept a loaded pistol in his desk to fend off any slave owners who would come looking for their property in his stop on the Underground Railroad. Theodore Parker said many famous things that we continue to talk about now. He said, for example, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, a saying that Martin Luther King was very fond of, and after that, Barack Obama. He also talked about a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And Abraham Lincoln borrowed that line as the closing to his Gettysburg Address. So Theodore Parker was really an amazing person. So these ministers defined Unitarianism and Universalism in the middle of the 1800s. But if you were to go to one of their services, you would feel that it was a pretty conventional, in some ways, Christian service, despite the Unitarian beliefs in the humanity of Jesus and the Universalist beliefs in the fact that all people would be saved. That was going to change radically just around this time. And it changed with the coming of the philosophy of Transcendentalism, which was developed by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Reverend Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a Unitarian minister, and his colleagues such as Henry Thoreau and Bronson Alcott. And Transcendentalism focuses on religion as a deeply personal experience that de-emphasizes the need for churches and ministers and Bibles, and ask people to use their senses to find the divine all around them, divinity and nature and humanity. Think of Henry Thoreau at Walden Pond, communing with nature. So this is a tremendously radical idea, but one that continues to influence us as Unitarian Universalists very strongly. Again, the idea of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning really comes from our transcendentalist roots. Now, Emerson, sort of like John Murray, did another thing that was very important. He hired Margaret Fuller, who was a writer, to be the editor of his newsletter, The Dial. And Margaret Fuller used The Dial, which was a transcendentalist publication, to spread the message of transcendentalism throughout the United States at that time. But she also published many very, very important books about women's equality and women's rights. And her writings are often thought to have led directly to the founding of the women's rights movement and the famous Seneca Falls Conference in 1848. So once again, women play a very important role in the history of not only Unitarianism and Universalism, but also the fight for equal rights for women in this country. So we're going to end this part of the story, not here. Next time, we will take up the story with the Civil War. We'll see how that changes many things. And then we'll take the story from the Civil War up to the present day. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.